Hey bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to talk about all of my reading statistics from 2019. Continuing on in my year wrap-up series, today we're going to talk about my reading statistics. I use a reading spreadsheet put together by my friend Crinny. I will link it down in the description box in case you guys want to go check it out. Before we get into the statistics that I put together, I want to take a peek at my Goodreads year in review as well because it has some different information. If I look off to the side, that's because I have my laptop here with all of my graphs on it. Okay, according to Goodreads, I read a total of 29,000 pages across 64 books. The shortest book I read was All Systems Red by Martha Wells, which makes sense, that's a novella, at 144 pages, and the longest book I read was A Memory of Light by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, which was 912 pages. The most popular book I read last year was The Book Thief by Marcus Zuzak, and the least popular book that I read last year was The Last Dragon Princess by Cynthia Payne, which was a self-published book. My average rating was 4.1, and the book that I read that had the highest rating on Goodreads was Obsidio by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. That's always interesting. I especially like looking to see what was the most popular book I read or the book I read with the highest rating on Goodreads, because that's information I can't get out of my spreadsheets. I had a pretty great reading year last year. I read the most that I have read in a year so far, which was 64 books, and my goal is always 52, so I totally blew it out of the water, at least according to me, last year. I also found a lot of new favorites last year, so I'm really happy with how my reading went, and I hope it continues into 2020. Okay, first let's start with the total number of books that I read in 2019. I picked up a total of 67 books. I did DNF 3 of them. That's how I got to my total number read of 64. And of those 64, 6 of them were rereads. The main difference here from last year is that I picked up 14 more books than I did in 2018. I did have slightly more DNFs and slightly less rereads, but it's a really small difference. Now, if we look at it by month, I read an average of 5.3 books every month, and that's excluding my DNFs. This is a whole 1 book higher than last year. Last year, I read an average of 4.3 books every month. Last year, the month that I read the most was July. I read 9 books in July. Versus in 2018, I had 2 months where I read 6 books. That was the most I had read in a month in 2018. The month that I read the least was in January when I only read 3 books. In 2018, 3 was also the smallest number of books I read in a month, and that happened in 3 months, but in 2019, I only had 1 month where I only read 3 books. So that's definitely an improvement. Switching over to number of pages, the total number of pages I read in 2019, including the pages that I read in the books that I DNF'd, comes out to 29,521, which is more than 5,000 pages more than the total that I read in 2018. That gives me an average of 2,460 pages a month and 81 pages a day, which is quite a bit higher than the 66 pages a day from 2018. The month where I read the most pages was July, which isn't a surprise considering I read the most books that month too. The total number of pages was 3,544, which is almost 700 pages more compared to the month in 2018 where I read the most pages. And then in January of this year, I read the least amount of pages at 1,885, which is at least 600 pages more than the least amount that I read in 2018. So basically, I read more this year. Next, I want to look at the length of books that I was reading last year. It's no surprise that most of the books that I read last year were between 300 and 500 pages. This graph is pretty similar to what I read in 2018, but I actually read slightly less books that are 300 to 500 pages and slightly more books that were between 150 and 300 pages. The average page length of books that I read in 2019 was 455, which is actually just a little bit shorter than the average length of book that I read in 2018. Next, looking at the format of books that I was reading in, the biggest category is audiobooks. I definitely listen to a lot of audiobooks. Keep in mind in this graph that I read books in multiple formats. This time when I made this graph, I was able to incorporate each format of the book that I read it in. So if I read a book in multiple formats, all of those formats are included in this graph. So the biggest category are audiobooks, which makes sense because most of the time when I'm reading something on audiobook, I also have it in another format. Okay, looking at star ratings. I gave the majority of what I read 4 stars, but I still had a lot of 5-star books too. I'm kind of surprised at the number of 2-star reads that I had. That's more 2 stars than I had last year. So last year I had slightly more 3-star reads and slightly less 2-star reads. But the percentages of 5 stars and 4 stars are actually pretty similar to what I read last year. And like I said earlier, my average star rating for the year is 4.1, which I'm really happy with. Ideally, I want my average rating to stay around a 4. I want to be mostly enjoying what I'm reading. And compared to last year, this is slightly higher. Last year I had an average rating of 4.0. Now looking at the number of books that I read that were series versus standalones. A little more than half of what I read last year were books that were part of a series. While I'm really happy with that number for last year, I did make it a goal for 2019 to bring that percentage up to 70%. I'm a little nervous that I bit off more than I can chew, but I'm going to definitely be making an effort this year to read percentage-wise, a larger number of books that are part of a series. So it'll be really interesting to see in my statistics video next year what this graph looks like. Oh, and compared to 2018, in 2018 I read 51% books that were part of a series. So I did read a little more books in a series this year compared to last year. I did read from a total of 24 different series in 2019, which was more than the 20 series I read from in 2018. Last year I started 17 series, which is definitely a lot. I also finished 7 and it decided to DNF or not continue in 6 series. Ideally, the DNF plus finished portion of this graph is larger than the number of series that I started, but obviously that's not what happened last year. And then as far as the total number of series that I'm currently in the middle of, that is 32 compared to the 26 I started the year out on. All right, taking a look at genres. I did this graph not as a pie chart, but as a bar graph because most books fall into multiple genres the way that I categorize them. And I definitely kind of simplified the genres as much as I could. Like urban fantasy really includes a lot of things that are more technically low fantasy, but I just put them together. So honestly, this graph looks pretty similar to last year, except for one big difference, and that is the horror genre. I read way more horror last year than I have in the past. In 2018, I only read 5 horror books, and in 2019, I read 17 horror books. Also, I didn't read any nonfiction in 2019, which is a little weird. Not that I read a lot of nonfiction, but I usually pick up 1 or 2 throughout the year. In 2018, I read 3 nonfiction books. And then as far as the number of authors that I read from, that was 56 versus the 44 authors that I read from in 2018. The most read author that I had was Brandon Sanderson with 5 books. I also read 4 books from Robert Jordan, which makes sense for both of those because I finished the Wheel of Time series last year, and I also read some Sanderson-only books. After those 2, the most number of books that I read from authors was 3, and those were Robin Hobb and Brent Weeks, which makes sense because I read series from those authors last year. And then looking at target audience or age category of books, 61% of the books that I read last year were adult books. That's actually slightly less percentage-wise than what I read in 2018. In 2018, I read 66% adult books. I also read 39% YA books in 2019 compared to 30% in 2018. This year, I did not read any middle grade or any new adult. I also thought it would be fun this year to look at narrators and see if I had any repeat narrators. The narrator that I listened to the most was Michael Kramer, which makes sense because of the Wheel of Time books, and he does Sanderson books. I listened to 5 books narrated by him. The only narrator I listened to 4 books from was Kate Redding, which again would be the Wheel of Time books. And then I had 3 narrators that I listened to 3 books each from, and those included Steve West, Paul Bomer, and Simon Vance. All right, and then the last thing I thought we'd look at is publishers. This is the first year that I've tracked the publishers I was reading from. I always think it's interesting to see what publishers people tend to like the most or tend to read from the most. But I gotta say that my numbers aren't really that interesting because apparently I read from just a ton of different publishers. So looking at the publishers of all of the books that I picked up in 2019, the publisher with the most books is gonna be Tor with 6 books, followed by Orbit with 5. And then I had a few publishers that I read 3 books from. There were 8 publishers that I read 2 books from, and 11 publishers that I read 1 book from. I thought maybe it would be interesting to look at the publishers of just the books that I gave 5 stars to, so I came up with this graph. Again, the largest category is Tor books, and I think that's because of the Wheel of Time books are by Tor, and obviously that's my favorite series. I had 3 more publishers that I had 2 books from that I read and rated 5 stars. So I'm going to try to keep that in mind when I'm looking at books that I want to read in the future. Maybe if I notice that a book that I want to read is from one of these publishers, I might put it higher on my priority list because maybe there's a higher chance that I will like it compared to other publishers. Alright guys, those are all of the statistics that I came up with for my 2019 reading. I hope you guys like this video. I really love watching stats videos and I love putting together my own stats. Even if I wasn't doing this video, I probably would have been putting these graphs together anyways. But hopefully you found it a little interesting. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.